There are secrets buried in Kansas soil that no preacher dared confess, no doctor dared record, no historian dared repeat, and you are about to hear one of them. In the year 1878, on a stretch of prairie where the wind cut like a blade and the wheat bent like supplicants in prayer, 4 brothers stood at the threshold of humanity and something far darker. Their names were Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood. To the neighbors, they were farmers, stoic men, God-fearing, their backs bent by labor and their hands scarred by work. But when the fever came, when Cedar Ridge fell under the shadow of a plague that stole voices and boiled flesh, the Blackwoods revealed themselves as something else entirely. They did not fall sick. Their children did not die. Their cattle grew fat while others withered. And when they laid their hands upon the dying, death recoiled. But the price was not silence. The price was transformation. Understand this before we descend further. What I am telling you is not recorded in any museum archive or science journal. The Kansas Medical Board refused to document it. The local clergy burned it from their registers. And even today, whispers of the Blackwoods Pact are spoken only in half sentences, with eyes lowered, as if speaking their names too clearly might draw them back. Because once you hear this truth, you cannot unhear it. It does not leave you, it stains you. The summer of 1878 began with a phantom sickness, 7 souls dead by mid-July, children convulsing in their beds, farmers clawing at their throats, as if invisible hands choked them, mothers muttering words they swore they did not know as they slipped beneath the dirt. Yet the Blackwood farm remained untouched. No fever, no coffin, no grave markers rising in their fields. And when one desperate father brought his son to their door, Josiah Blackwood placed his calloused palm upon the boy's forehead, and the fever broke. The boy lived. But Josiah did not walk away the same. His brothers saw it first. The nosebleeds, the vacant eyes, the whisper he repeated under his breath, "It's inside us now." From that night onward, Cedar Ridge divided itself in 2. Those who buried their dead, and those who bent knee to the Blackwoods, begging for a touch, a prayer, a salvation that was not holy but something older, hungrier, and utterly without mercy. Tonight, I will show you where faith ends and corruption begins. You will not come back unchanged, and you will not be able to claim you didn't know. The first healing should have been a miracle. That's how the town wanted to believe it. God's mercy delivered through 4 steadfast brothers. But miracles do not come without ripples, and in Cedar Ridge, those ripples became waves that never stopped breaking. When young Timothy Fletcher rose from his sickbed, laughing through cracked lips and begging for bread, his mother fell to her knees, praising the Lord. But she wasn't looking at her son. She was looking at Josiah Blackwood, who staggered back against the chapel wall, blood dripping down his chin. His brothers caught him before he collapsed, their hands trembling not from fear, but from recognition. Something had answered his prayer. Something had entered the Blackwoods that night. Ezra, the eldest, spoke first of it, though never in public. He told his brothers in the dead of night, when the prairie winds howled against their shutters, that he felt the world tilt when Josiah touched that boy. Caleb, the bookkeeper, swore he heard voices rise beneath the chapel stones, whispers older than scripture, murmurs that bent language into shapes his mind could barely hold. And Abel, the youngest, only smiled, fasting for days, his lips cracked, eyes bright with a fever that was not of this earth. He said what none of them dared, "It is not God we serve now. It is something that was here before him." Still, the people came. They knocked on the Blackwoods' door with trembling hands, begging for salvation. And one by one, the brothers obliged. They laid palms on burning foreheads. They whispered words that bent the air. They drew the sickness out and took something in. By the end of August, 17 souls walked the prairie who should have been beneath it. 17 spared lives, 17 debts carved into the Blackwoods' marrow. And each night, As the brothers gathered in their chapel, their prayers deepened into tones no human throat should carry. The townsfolk began to notice changes. The Blackwoods' eyes gleamed pale under moonlight, reflecting back like predators in the brush. Their shadows no longer obeyed the sun, stretching wrong, flickering like broken film across the ground. Horses reared when they passed. Infants wailed, but none dared speak against them, for when death came calling, the brothers could send it away. Do you understand now? This was not immunity. It was invitation. They had opened themselves as vessels, and something filled them. Something Cedar Ridge would never put to paper. Something you, even now, can feel brushing against your spine as you listen. Bay, early September. Cedar Ridge was a town split in two. Those who prayed at the chapel of the Blackwoods, and those who kept their shutters closed tight, whispering the brothers' names like curses under their breath. The sickness that had swept through the county began to wither, not because medicine triumphed, but because the brothers willed it so. Each house they entered was marked, not with scripture, not with the sign of the cross, but with silence, with a lingering vibration in the walls that never seemed to leave. The dying awoke gasping, spared by unseen hands, but the air inside those homes never felt clean again. It clung like damp wool, thick with something that did not belong to men. Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, tried to record what he saw. He kept journals filled with trembling script, temperatures, symptoms, prayers whispered in tongues he couldn't identify. But every dawn, the pages turned to ash without fire. He hid them under floorboards, locked them in chests, even buried them beneath the soil. Always the same.
Ash.
As though the knowledge itself refused to remain written. As though the truth resisted capture, the brothers themselves began to change in ways no fever could explain. Ezra no longer blinked, even when grit from the prairie wind struck his eyes. Josiah's hands shook when they weren't resting on the sick, as though they hungered for contact with dying flesh. Caleb's meticulous ledgers filled with symbols he claimed he never wrote, spirals and runes etched in ink that shimmered under lamplight. And Abel, thin, restless Abel, wandered the farm barefoot, muttering prayers to a god no one recognized, eyes locked on something only he could see. Their chapel hymns, once simple and earnest, twisted into low dissonant chants that drifted across the prairie at night. Dogs howled. Children woke screaming. Mothers clutched them close, whispering that the Blackwoods were men of faith, though their hearts no longer believed it. But the strangest change of all was not in the brothers. It was in the 17 they had saved. Those spared from death began to dream of endless fields, their stalks black as ink. They woke with strange cravings, hunger that bread and meat could not calm. They began to whisper in their sleep, voices echoing tones that belonged to the chapel. Survivors, yes, but marked, claimed. And you listening now, you need to ask yourself, if death reached for your child, your wife, your brother, what would you give? What would you invite into your blood just to buy another sunrise? The Blackwoods gave everything, and what answered them was not mercy. By mid-September, Cedar Ridge was no longer the town it had been. Yes, the fever had thinned, coffins no longer lined the roads, and families once again gathered for supper. But under that fragile veneer of normalcy, something darker had taken root. People crossed the street when the Blackwoods passed, yet they still bowed their heads, half in gratitude, half in dread. For though the brothers had given them back their children, their husbands, their mothers, the price was written in the air itself. The prairie no longer felt like open sky and wheat. It felt heavy, watching, listening. And every soul in Cedar Ridge knew why. The chapel became the center of that weight. Its limestone walls, quarried by the brothers themselves, seemed to breathe. By day it stood silent, a squat block of stone on the edge of the fields. But by night, its windows flickered with strange light, and the chants inside seeped into the soil. Witnesses claimed the very rocks groaned, as though straining under a burden too great. Those brave, or foolish, enough to creep close returned pale, lips sealed, unable to describe what they had seen. Some swore they saw shadows moving on the walls, shapes that didn't match the brothers' bodies. Others claimed the voices inside carried harmonics no human throat could produce. But all agreed on one thing: whatever dwelled in that chapel was not meant for human ears. The Blackwoods themselves withdrew further from the town. No more idle talk at the general store. No more shared labor in the fields. Their farm flourished even as their neighbors' land lay barren, cattle strong while others starved. Wheat grew tall and gold on their soil, but none of it was ever harvested. It stood like a forest of offerings, bending in the wind like a congregation in prayer. Locals whispered that the crop itself leaned toward the chapel at dusk, bowing to something unseen. And the 17 spared. They could not stay away. Drawn as if by invisible cords, they crept to the chapel at night, leaving offerings, bread, silver, even strands of their children's hair. They never spoke of why. They never admitted what they saw, but they kept returning, bound by a debt no sermon could wash clean. Do you see the pattern now? This was never about healing. This was an exchange, a bargain written not in scripture, but in the marrow of the living, and bargains of that kind are never settled. They only deepen. The first cracks in memory appeared not in the earth, but in the records. Cedar Ridge kept its ledgers as any frontier town did. Births, deaths, marriages carefully inscribed in neat cursive by the county clerk. Yet when Reverend Hill went searching for the Blackwood brothers' origins, he found nothing. No birth certificates, no baptismal entries, no trace of them in Kansas or beyond. The Blackwoods seemed to have arrived one morning in 1878, 4 men with calloused hands and solemn eyes, ready to work the land. And for years, no one questioned it. But now, with their chapel throbbing like a second heart at the edge of town, silence was no longer enough. The Reverend pressed harder, and each time he sought their paper trail, something else in his office withered. Ink fading to gray, pages curling as though burned, locks on cabinets rusting overnight. By the 3rd week, the records for other families began vanishing too. Names of old settlers erased as though history itself recoiled from their pursuit. The town's elders remembered details, but even those slipped like sand. One swore the Blackwoods came from Missouri, another from Ohio, a third from no place he could name. A woman insisted she'd attended their mother's funeral, yet could not recall her face, her name, even the cemetery. Stories tangled, dates shifted, memories contradicted one another until truth itself seemed to buckle. The harder Cedar Ridge tried to recall, the deeper the forgetting dug. By autumn, people whispered that the brothers were not born at all. They were delivered. Not by mothers, but by something else, something that knew how to wear the skin of men. The Blackwoods did not correct these whispers. They did not defend themselves. Instead, they watched. Standing in rows, silent, eyes black with sleeplessness, they let the stories twist. In that silence, dread grew. For when the town forgot where the Blackwoods had come from, it also began to forget what it had been before them. The fever's dead blurred into nameless shadows. Streets felt older, as if Cedar Ridge had always been marked. And in the heart of that forgetting stood the chapel, unmoved, unyielding, unblinking. You must understand, erasure is not absence. Erasure is consumption. When a name is swallowed, when a birth is unmade, something takes its place. Cedar Ridge thought it was losing history. What it was losing was itself. It began with the eyes, the 17 survivors. Those who should have been rotting in graves started waking in the night, pupils wide as if staring into endless dark. Neighbors swore their irises flickered under lamplight, catching colors not found in human eyes. Hints of silver, oily shades of violet that shimmered and vanished in a blink. Their families said it was exhaustion, lingering sickness. But exhaustion does not make a man speak in 2 voices. And exhaustion does not make a child laugh in perfect harmony with the chapel bells, even when the bells have not rung. The dreams deepened. No longer confined to endless black fields, the spared began seeing each other within the visions, walking side by side across landscapes of ash, carrying torches that never burned out. When they woke, they remembered details they could not have invented, the exact words whispered by another in the dream, the same scars burning on their arms, the same fragments of hymns lodged in their throats. It was as if their sleep had become a gathering, a congregation inside some other realm. And the more they dreamed together, the less they lived apart. Families said they drifted toward each other during the day, meeting silently at crossroads, staring west toward the Blackwood farm. Not speaking, just waiting. Then came the marks, small at first, raised ridges along the ribs, faint spirals on the palms, like the symbols Caleb scrawled in his ledgers. But within weeks the shapes grew clearer, twisting into patterns that seemed to shift with the light. One woman's skin bloomed with black lines that resembled wheat stalks. Another boy's veins turned dark, visible even through his flesh, branching like roots. The physician tried to lance them, to treat them with poultices, but the marks returned overnight sharper, deeper. Dr. Morrison's notes trembled with one repeated line. They are not scars, they are signatures. And what terrified the town most was not the sight of these transformations. It was the silence of those who bore them. No screams, no prayers, no pleas for help. The spared accepted the marks as calmly as one accepts freckles from the sun. They seemed almost grateful, as if the sickness had not been lifted from them, but redirected, as if their survival had bound them to the brothers in ways no sermon could explain. Listen closely, this was no healing. This was inscription. The town thought it had won a war against disease. In truth, it had allowed something else to write upon its flesh. No one in Cedar Ridge wanted to admit it, but by October, the chapel had become the town's true heartbeat. The church bells in the square rang hollow, compared to the low hum that seeped from the limestone walls at dusk. Families barred their doors when the chanting began, yet curiosity gnawed. Fear can silence a town for only so long. Eventually, someone had to look. It was Samuel Wren, a farmhand barely 20, who first crept to the chapel windows. He carried no lantern, only a blade of corn tucked in his shirt for luck. When he returned at dawn, his hair had gone white, his lips cracked from muttering the same phrase. They were not praying. They were feeding. He died 2 nights later, his veins blackened like the boy marked before him. His body was buried in haste, but whispers spread. What had he seen through those pains? What had turned his hair to ash in a single night? Others tried. A midwife, 2 hunters, even Dr. Morrison, desperate for answers, desperate to reclaim his sanity. None came back the same. They spoke of the brothers gathered around the sick, their hands not placed in blessing but plunged deep into the flesh, drawing something unseen from the bodies. Some claimed to hear a sound like wings unfurling inside the chapel, though no bird ever emerged. Others swore the walls themselves stretched, pulsing like a lung with each chant. But the most chilling detail was always the same. The survivors of those rituals did not walk out. They drifted, silent, glass-eyed, as if carrying a burden too heavy for words. The town begged Reverend Hill to act, to storm the chapel and banish whatever had rooted itself there. But Hill hesitated. His sermons faltered. He confessed to his wife that he, too, had dreamed the fields of black stalks, and that the voice within those fields had promised him healing for his frail son. By then, even the most devout men understood the chapel was no longer a place of worship. It was a contract written in stone, and those who entered paid with more than prayer. You see, every ritual has a witness. Every bargain requires someone to look upon it and remember. Cedar Ridge did look, but what they saw was not meant for them, and once you see, you cannot unsee. You carry it the way Samuel Wren carried it to his grave. By late October, the line between chapel and prairie dissolved. At first, it was only the wind, strange currents sweeping across the wheat fields in perfect circles, as if stirred by invisible hands. Then came the whispers, low, rhythmic, carrying across the rows at dusk. Farmers swore the stalks themselves rustled in cadence, bending not with the breeze, but with the chants echoing from the limestone walls. Cattle refused to graze near the blackwood acreage. Horses bolted at the faintest sound of those hymns. Even the insects fell silent, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed on the skin like a storm about to break. It was during harvest that the first horror rooted itself in plain sight. 3 men attempted to reap the edge of the blackwood wheat, desperate after their own crops had failed. The moment their scythes touched the stalks, the ground shook. Witnesses swore the earth groaned like a wounded animal. The stalks bled, a thick, dark resin spilling from their cuts, staining hands and tools. 2 of the men dropped dead within minutes. Their eyes rolled back, their bodies rigid as if nailed to the soil. The third staggered away, coughing up the same resin until his lungs collapsed. By morning, the harvested wheat was gone, the bodies swallowed by the soil itself. All that remained was silence. From then on, no one touched the blackwood fields. But the spared, the 17 marked, wandered there freely. They walked barefoot through the stalks at night, humming in unison, pressing their palms against the soil, as if greeting an old friend. Children spied them from windows, moving in deliberate patterns, tracing circles that glowed faintly in moonlight. Some swore the stalks bent toward them, bowing as if to priests. And still, the brothers remained unflinching. They did not harvest, did not explain, did not reassure. They simply watched, their faces unreadable, while the land itself began to transform into an extension of the chapel. It was no longer wheat. It was congregation, a living testament to whatever bargain had been struck in fevered whispers. Understand, this land remembers. When rituals spill beyond walls, the soil becomes scripture. The crops become choir, and every breath of wind carries the hymn forward. Cedar Ridge thought the sickness was their trial. But the real sickness was rooting itself now, in the earth, in the people, in the marrow of the town. The breaking point came on an unseasonably cold night in November. The town had endured the whispers, the changing fields, the silent processions of the spared. But when young Clara Hensley vanished from her bed, something snapped. She was only 12, pale from the fever she'd once escaped, her skin already etched with faint spirals like the others. Her parents swore she had been asleep beside them. Yet by morning, her footprints led straight from their home to the chapel. And from there, nothing. No tracks leaving, no sign of struggle. Just the heavy hush of stone walls that would not give her back. Enough was enough. A group of men gathered, farmers, shopkeepers, even Reverend Hill himself, clutching his Bible like a weapon. They armed themselves with rifles and lanterns, swearing they would break into the chapel, drag Clara home, and end whatever darkness festered inside. For hours, Cedar Ridge held its breath as the mob marched across the prairie. Windows flickered with candlelight. Mothers clutched children tight, waiting for gunfire, waiting for screams. But the night was eerily still. The lanterns bobbed across the fields, reached the chapel, vanished inside. Minutes stretched into hours. No shouts, no sign of struggle, just silence. When dawn finally broke, the men had not returned. Not a single one. The only thing left was their rifles, stacked neatly outside the chapel door, polished clean of fingerprints. By afternoon, whispers spread that the missing men were not gone at all. Some claimed to have seen them at the edge of the blackwood fields, standing motionless among the wheat, eyes blank, faces slack, hands clasped as if in prayer. Others swore they heard their voices woven into the night chants, familiar tones now bent into alien harmonies. Clara's parents swore they heard their daughter's laughter within those hymns, high and clear. Though her face never appeared again, The town learned then what defiance truly meant. To resist the Blackwoods was not to fight them, but to be absorbed. To step against them was to step into their choir. And the Blackwoods never raised a hand, never fired a shot. They simply waited, because resistance itself was the offering. You see, power like theirs doesn't need violence. It only needs patience. Defiance feeds it, rebellion crowns it, and every attempt to fight the Blackwoods made them stronger, not weaker. After the failed uprising, Cedar Ridge was no longer one town. It was two. On one side were those who believed the Blackwoods had been chosen by God himself, that the chapel was a new covenant, and that to resist it was to invite damnation. They spoke openly of miracles, of loved ones spared from death, of wheat that never spoiled and water that never ran dry on Blackwood land. They carried offerings to the chapel at dusk. Bread, silver, even blood drawn from their own palms, laying them at the threshold before retreating into the night. To them, the brothers were not men at all. They were vessels, intercessors, saints of a darker gospel. The other half of the town trembled in silence. They avoided the chapel, avoided the spared, even avoided their own neighbors. They barred their doors tighter with each chant, nailed crosses to their windows, whispered desperate prayers to a God they feared had abandoned them. Yet even they could not deny the truth. Their crops failed, their wells dried, their children coughed blood while the Blackwood followers thrived. The divide deepened with every passing week, suspicion turning neighbor against neighbor. A man might be seen speaking kindly to Ezra Blackwood one day and find his own barn burned by nightfall, his family accused of betrayal by dawn. The spared walked between both camps like phantoms, their marks now bold and glowing faintly in firelight. They did not answer questions. They did not plead for understanding. They simply drifted, called to the chapel when the chants rose, their bodies moving in perfect rhythm, as if pulled by strings. Families wept to see their loved ones vanish into the night. But none dared to stop them. They knew what happened to those who resisted. Even Reverend Hill, once the moral anchor of Cedar Ridge, faltered. His sermons grew thin, half-hearted, his eyes hollow. Parishioners whispered that he too had been seen on the chapel steps. Head bowed, his Bible clutched not in defiance, but in offering. When questioned, he denied it. But his voice cracked and his hands trembled. By December, the prairie itself reflected the division. On Blackwood land, wheat rose high even through frost, swaying like golden flames. Beyond it, the fields of the doubters lay barren, gray, frozen to the bone. It was no longer faith versus fear. It was survival versus extinction, and survival has a way of silencing conscience. The longest night of the year fell heavy over Cedar Ridge. Snow drifted across the prairie, muffling every sound. Yet from the Blackwood chapel came a resonance, so deep it rattled window panes, and shuddered in the bones of cattle. The solstice marked something, though none could say what. By dusk, the spared were already moving through the streets, barefoot in the snow, their skin bare to the cold yet untouched by frostbite. Their spiral marks glowed faintly blue beneath the moonlight, leading them like lanterns toward the chapel. Families tried to hold them back. Some locked doors, others bound wrists with rope, but every restraint broke. Every chain failed. The spared walked forward as if carried on unseen shoulders, their eyes fixed on that flickering stone temple. Inside, the brothers were waiting, witnesses, though none ever admitted willingly to being there. Spoke of walls that blood condensation thick as oil, of torches burning without flame, of an altar built not of wood but of interlocked bones. Ezra stood at its head, chanting in a language no one recognized. Josiah's trembling hands steadied, only when pressed against the spared. Caleb scrawled symbols across the stone floor with chalk that never dulled, lines that glowed like veins in the earth. And Abel laughed, high and thin, as though he alone understood what was unfolding. When midnight struck, the chapel convulsed. Snow outside melted in a ring, exposing raw earth that pulsed with heat. The spared raised their voices in unison, words pouring from their throats in the same alien hymn. Then, in perfect silence, they opened their mouths wide. From within poured not breath, not scream, but a vapor, thick, black, alive. The brothers inhaled it, their bodies shuddering as though feeding, their eyes rolling back into pale whites, and when the last wisp left the spared, they collapsed to the ground, motionless. For hours they lay still. The town wept, believing them dead, believing the bargain had finally claimed them. But as dawn bled across the horizon, each one rose again. Their marks were gone, their skin flawless, their eyes bright with something sharper than life. Clara Hensley stood among them, smiling faintly, as if she had never been missing at all. That was the night Cedar Ridge understood the truth. Death had not been avoided. It had been remade, and the spared were no longer survivors. They were vessels. By New Year's Eve, Cedar Ridge had become a place of silence. Curtains stayed drawn, fires burned low, and the sound of hymns from the Blackwood Chapel gnawed through every wall like termites chewing beams. The spared walked among the living again, but not as they had before. Their movements were too precise. Their voices carried harmonics that set dogs whining and infants shrieking. They smiled often, but never blinked in unison with their words. People whispered that when you looked at them, really looked, you saw two gazes inside one skull. One human, one ancient. Clara Hensley moved through town with an ease that unsettled every man who saw her. Once frail, her steps now barely touched the snow, leaving no prints. She spoke softly to her father in the butcher's shop, but neighbors swore they saw his shadow flinch when she placed a hand on his arm. Others noticed strange hungers. Bread, meat, water, all consumed without satisfaction. Some were found standing in the fields before dawn, mouths open to the sky, inhaling the wind as if it were food. Fear spread like its own sickness. Parents barred their doors even to kin. A mother locked her own daughter outside after she returned from the chapel, claiming the child's laugh didn't belong to her anymore. The sheriff, hollow-eyed since the night of his failed questioning, tried to hold order, but each command cracked his voice. He spent hours pacing his barn, staring at the rope coiled in his hands. And yet the brothers were never accused. No mob gathered, no pitchforks, no torches. Because beneath the fear was something worse: obedience. The spared, now remade, carried an influence that worked deeper than threats. Men who swore never to bow bent their heads when the spared passed. Women who once cursed the Blackwoods now left offerings on the chapel steps. Bread, coins, even teeth pulled from their children's mouths. One evening, Reverend Cole stood in the square, Bible trembling in his hands. He shouted that the brothers were false prophets, demons clothed in flesh, that the spared were not their neighbors but puppets strung by darkness. His sermon ended before it began. The spared turned their heads in unison and looked at him. Only looked. His words broke in his throat. His pages burned to ash in his palms. He fell silent, and silent he remained until the day he hanged himself in the rectory loft. By January, Cedar Ridge was no longer a town. It was a stage. The brothers directed, the spared performed, and everyone else, whether they admitted it or not, watched in terror from the Wingsby mid-January. Cedar Ridge was no longer just a haunted village. It was a node, a beacon. Travelers who passed through the county told stories of strange lights on the horizon, pale columns rising into the sky like phantom beacons, pulsing in rhythm with no storm. Wagon teams broke down inexplicably at the crossroads near the Blackwood farm. Horses refused to step onto the dirt road that led east, digging their hooves into the ground until their legs bled. Merchants spoke of voices whispering from the prairie grass, offering bargains in tongues they did not understand. The spared, now vessels of something greater, began leaving the town at night. No one saw them depart, but neighbors woke to empty beds, tracks in the snow leading toward the chapel, then vanishing into bare soil. Within weeks, whispers spread to nearby towns, of strangers arriving at night, eyes pale, palms feverishly warm, speaking softly of healing. Some were cured, yes, but others woke days later with the same faint spirals carved into their skin. As if the disease had been traded for a mark, Kansas newspapers mentioned an outbreak quelled in Harper County, then fell silent. Yet a telegraph operator in Wichita swore messages he received about the Blackwoods erased themselves the moment he looked away. A deputy marshal sent to Cedar Ridge vanished without report. His horse returned riderless, saddle damp with sweat, eyes wide in terror. The brothers' farm itself grew stranger with each passing week. Wheat sprouted green in the dead of winter, bending toward the chapel as if the stalks themselves were bowing. Smoke curled from the chimney though no one chopped wood. Visitors swore the limestone walls pulsed like living muscle when touched. And all the while, hymns drifted across the prairie, carrying harmonies that sounded less like human voices and more like a chorus of things imitating humanity. But the most chilling sign came from the spared themselves. Their influence seeped into every conversation, every dream. A child in town drew pictures of the chapel, surrounded by roots that reached across the map of America, clawing into cities he'd never seen. Old Mrs. Garrison, who hadn't left her bed in years, suddenly sat up one night and whispered, "It doesn't end here. It never ends here. The Blackwoods are just the beginning." Then she died before the sun rose. Cedar Ridge understood, though none spoke it aloud. The plague had ended, but something far older, far hungrier, had been born, and the prairie, vast and endless, was its perfect cradle. By February, the brothers no longer hid what they were becoming. Ezra, once the stoic farmer with soil under his nails, now walked with a presence so heavy that men stepped aside before they realized they had moved. His shadow lagged behind him, twisting and stretching across walls, like a separate being that wanted to detach. Josiah's trembling hands had steadied, but only when laid upon flesh. He touched the sick, the spared, even the healthy, as though drawing something invisible from their blood. Caleb no longer spoke much in public, but in private homes, his ledger pages appeared beneath pillows, scrawled with names of unborn children, debts yet to be owed. And Abel, the youngest, burned brightest of them all. He preached in the chapel with eyes closed, voice layered with tones no human throat could produce. People listened, not because they believed, but because their bones vibrated with every word until resistance was impossible. The spared gathered nightly, their blue spirals now faint scars, reminders of a pact no medicine could erase. They sang with the brothers, their hymns echoing like thunder across the prairie. Farmers claimed their livestock stopped calving that month, their cattle wombs barren, while wild animals crowded closer to the chapel, as if drawn by a predator they could not resist. Then came the first sacrifice. It was not spoken of directly, but everyone knew. Thomas Weller, a young father whose wife died in the plague, vanished one night after kneeling too close to the chapel doors. His boots were found abandoned in the snow, but no body, no blood. Days later, his voice could be heard in the brothers' hymns, layered in the dissonant chords, recognizable, but twisted into something unearthly. Mothers wept when they recognized it. Fathers forbade their children from humming any tune, for fear the brothers might hear and claim it as their own. The transformation of the land deepened. Wells near the farm ran warm even in frost, their waters tasting of iron. Roots bulged from the soil, cracking frozen ground, stretching outward in patterns that resembled veins. The spared often walked those roots barefoot, eyes closed, whispering prayers in a tongue older than English. But the true horror revealed itself one evening when Clara Hensley, resurrected, flawless, untouchable, walked into the town square. She raised her hand, and for a brief moment, the stars above blinked out as if the sky itself bent to her gesture. Cedar Ridge gasped, but no one screamed, because deep down, every soul knew the brothers had bargained not just for survival, but for dominion, and the prairie would never belong to men again. Spring should have brought renewal to Cedar Ridge, but that year the thaw unveiled only corruption. Snow melt pooled in ditches, but the water shimmered dark, reflecting not the sky above but shapes that bent and crawled beneath the surface. Farmers who tried to irrigate with it found their crops sprouting twisted, stalks splitting to reveal flesh instead of grain. The air itself felt charged, like the whole prairie hummed with a frequency just out of hearing, tugging at teeth and nerves. The brothers rarely left the chapel now. When they did, the spared followed in processions, eyes glazed, lips moving in silent prayer. Their numbers had grown, not shrunk. Whole families once untouched by the plague now joined them willingly, abandoning farms, leaving meals uneaten as if an invisible hand had called them. Cedar Ridge, once a frontier town clinging to life, became a hollowed shell, its streets walked by vessels of something greater. And then came the final night, the night every survivor would refuse to speak of. They said the earth trembled without storm, that a sound like thousands of voices, chanting in harmony, poured across the prairie, not just from the chapel, but from the soil, from the trees, from the bones of the dead still buried beneath the frost. Witnesses claimed the brothers ascended the chapel steps together, their eyes glowing with the cold blue of the spared, their mouths open as light poured out, like fireflies escaping a lantern. But where light should have brought hope, it only carried dread, because within that radiance, the faces of the lost could be seen, frozen, screaming, reaching. By dawn, the chapel stood empty. No brothers, no spared, no hymns, only silence. Yet the land bore the mark of what had occurred. The wheat fields that sprouted in the dead of winter never withered, even when uprooted. The wells never ran cold. Travelers spoke of hearing hymns when the wind shifted, though no soul remained to sing them. And deep within the limestone of the chapel walls, symbols glowed faintly, as though something had written itself into the stone for all time. The government eventually declared Cedar Ridge abandoned, the plague its explanation, the silence its excuse. But locals know better. They say the Blackwoods did not vanish. They transcended, that the prairie itself became their vessel, and that anyone foolish enough to wander too close will hear their voices still, offering bargains, promising life, demanding something far greater in return. And the final warning passed down in whispers is always the same. The Blackwoods never ended. They wait, and when the world grows desperate enough, they will be called again.